They all jumped.
Kidding me? Out. Hand. Go. There you go.
My hair is getting quite out of hand. I've just been a bit nervous about going to the barbers over the last few months, but I'll get that sorted out at some point. Now, just like modern English, Old English had quite a lot of regional diversity. It had regional accents and regional dialects. And because spelling was not standardised, we can actually tell a certain amount about those dialects from texts that were written in them. So people would be spelling using their own pronunciation or spelling things according to regional conventions rather than an overall standard like we have nowadays. If you want to get straight to the point with example sentences, I'll just put a timestamp on the screen and you can skip to that. But otherwise, you'll normally see 4 major Anglo-Saxon dialects referenced in the literature, and those are West Saxon, Mercian, Kentish and Northumbrian, although in reality it was more of a gradual spectrum from south to north and from east to west, just as it is today. But what we mustn't do is imagine that the Old English regional differences were the same as modern regional differences. So for instance, Northumbrian Old English was not just Old English with a northern accent, or it was, but it wasn't what we would see as a northern accent nowadays. And that's because there's not a linear progression in each individual place from the Old English spoken there to the modern English spoken there. It works in a much more kind of diffusionist way, so changes spread from centres of influence. And I'll try and show what I mean using a diagram, but I don't know how well it'll capture it. The dialect that you'll often find in textbooks is West Saxon, and that's the dialect spoken in West South, otherwise known as Wessex. That's the Old English that I've generally used in these videos. You'll sometimes find Mercian and Northumbrian lumped together as the Anglian dialects because they share a lot of features, although I don't think there's any strong suggestion that they're specifically the continuation of the continental language of the Angles. Anglian is just a word we apply to them. All of the Anglo-Saxon dialects developed from the West Germanic dialect continuum that also gave rise to modern Dutch and German and Low Saxon and things like that. So in a lot of cases you can only fully understand the differences by comparing the dialects to Proto-Germanic or to West Germanic rather than by comparing them to each other. But I'll try my best at comparing them to each other because I think that's how we tend to compare modern dialects. I'll take most of my information from work by Fulk and Lass and I'll put those sources in the description, but I'll supplement it with some information from modern dialects. There are a few ways that the late West Saxon dialect, which is kind of textbook Old English, is unusual among Old English dialects, and one of those is the pair of diphthongs eu and iu, which are long and short variants of the same diphthong, probably, although there's some debate about how the short one was pronounced. And this is a sound that only really happens in situations of I mutation, which is, it would take a lot of time to go into, but I'll put a slide on screen in case anybody wants to understand it a bit better. So eu only really appears as the mutated version of another sound, either ow or il. And in other dialects, ow mutates to e, and il mutates to e. So the word lichton becomes lichton in non-West Saxon dialects. A key vowel difference that probably would have marked you out as not being local to Wessex arises from the fact that in early Old English, what was all in the West Germanic dialect continuum did what's called fronting, so its articulation moved to the front of the mouth. So all became if you sort of go or, you can feel your tongue moving to the front of the mouth, so that's what happened. Or became and in a lot of regions this just stayed throughout the Old English period, but throughout a lot of Wessex it unrounded and became e. So what I mean by unrounded is when you say your lips are rounded when you say it, whereas when you say e, your tongue is in the same place but your lips are no longer rounded. So in a lot of Wessex it unrounded to e. So for example, what in Wessex would be edel would in other dialects be ödel. Edel, ödel, edel, ödel. Now, like I said, Mercia and Northumbria have a certain amount in common with each other dialect-wise, so they're referred to as the Anglian dialects. So certain diphthongs, our and il, become smoothed to monophthongs in certain phonological environments. So for instance, milk becomes milk. In some situations where you have our in West Saxon, you just have o in Mercian and Northumbrian. So instead of half, you have half. Now specifically to Northumbrian, I'll go into a bit of detail about each one. Specifically to Northumbrian, certain areas of Northumbria would have had certain consonants, vela, k and g, where most other dialects would have had them palatalized, ch and y. So something like chiriche might be kirike, bruj might be brug, muj might be mug, ich would have been ik in certain areas of Northumbria, and you can tell that from Middle English spellings of the word, Northern Middle English spellings. But that wouldn't have applied everywhere in Northumbria, so in some places if you had an unstressed word ending with k, it would turn into an allophone of the phoneme h, ch, you know, that phoneme can be realised in a number of ways in Old English. So in some places in Northumbria, rather than ich, you'd have ich, which is quite similar to the modern German pronunciation, although that's largely a coincidence. In Northumbrian, rather than the short and long diphthongs eo and il, you're much more likely to find the more archaic versions of these diphthongs, ew and ew, which were widespread in the early Old English period and then changed later on. So instead of hail, you'd get something like hew. If you watch the video on pronouncing Old English vowels, you might remember that the ow and ow diphthongs of Old English come from the ow diphthong in Proto-Germanic, which is a reconstructed diphthong. In the southern part of Northumbria, it seems as though the second element of this diphthong stayed rounded, that is, pronounced with rounded lips, for a lot longer. So while we can't pinpoint the exact vowel quality, you'd probably have, where you'd have ow in Wessex, you'd probably have something like ow or el in that part of Northumbria. So for example, lauf instead of laugh, lauf, laugh, lauf, laugh. Another thing I find interesting is that in writing, in most dialects, the infinitive form of a verb tends to end in something like one of these two endings I put on screen. But in Northumbrian, the N is often left off of the end in spelling. And in the world's languages, this kind of thing very often happens through a process called nasalization, which is where, to economise, rather than having a vowel and a nasal consonant, you instead just have a nasalised vowel. And it just means the tongue is moving a bit less, and we all economise in ways like this when we're talking quickly. And I think that might be at play here. So Fulk gives the example of what would normally be kuman is something like kuma in parts of Northumbria. So kuman, kuma, kuman, kuma. And this is probably reflective of a wider pattern. So unstressed endings of words tended to be where you'd find a lot of grammatical information in Old English, so information about case and about gender. So when you got rid of unstressed endings, cases and genders start to become less distinguishable from each other. And that levelling of grammatical distinctions seems to have started in I've lost my train of thought. Started in the north of England and made its way southwards. So that reduction of endings is part of a wider pattern. Moving on to what's next, the Mercian dialect, which was spoken in this kind of area. One of the major features of pronunciation that shows up in spelling is the raising of a to something like e. And in a kind of reverse domino effect, this had a kind of pulling effect. It dragged a to front and become a to fill its place. This is the most common interpretation of the spelling evidence, and it fits the best with our understanding of sound change. So this means that a word like fader becomes feder. Something like darum becomes darum. Bear in mind, this only applies to the short versions of these vowels. A point for the phonology people that might be watching, I've mentioned in other videos that in most Old English dialects the vowel represented by A seems to have been spelled interchangeably with either A or O when it occurred in front of a nasal consonant. And that's led some people to suggest that it's got a rounded and possibly nasalised allophone in those contexts. something like o or on. In Mercian text, this sound is very regularly spelled with o, and it's rarely ever spelled with a. So it might be that this change is phonemicized in Mercian varieties of Old English. That is, it might be that there's a unique o phoneme or an o phoneme, or it might be that the vowel has just merged with o in this environment. And finally, Kent, even though it was the smallest of the four kingdoms, it did have distinctive features of its own. So for one thing, by the late Old English period, the diphthongs eo and eo are often spelt like this. And if we take this at face value, it seems like the first element has raised from e to e, which is a very common sound change, and the second element has unrounded, so you no longer pronounce it with rounded lips as you do with e or. So it might have unrounded to something like r, although the exact quality is harder to pin down. Unrounded back vowels are not something I'm very good at pronouncing, apart from quite low ones. So a word like Helvon might be given as something like hiaben. At the same time, you have a merger of long and short versions of a and u to just e, as it's shown in spelling. So a word like gath becomes something like gaith. And if you really listen to those, it's very easy to imagine it just being a difference in regional accent at the time. Gath, gaith, gath, gaith. There are obviously fine details of pronunciation that we can't know in most cases, which is one of the annoying things about historical linguistics. For example, it's hard to know the regional distribution of how the L phoneme was pronounced across dialects. So in modern English, L can be pronounced anywhere from L to L, with a lot of dialects having both of those as allophones of the same phoneme. So you'd have, for example, I'll use my own dialect as an example. I have L before a vowel, but L after a vowel, which you can hear in the word lilt, lilt. But other dialects do this differently. And another thing that's uncertain is how the letter R is pronounced across the country. So a lot of people go for the trill or the tap, ra or era, which there's a bit of evidence for in southern England up until the 1700s, at which point we probably started using the approximant r. But there are rural northern English dialects that use a uvular realisation, something like r, into the 20th century. I think it's a bit labialised, so can I pronounce that? R, r, something like that. To the point that there are actual audio recordings of that phenomenon. And it's possible this is a holdover from the original Northumbrian sound, and that the trilled R used in Northern English later just replaced that in most places. And I've noticed something, this is completely anecdotal, so there might be no merit in it at all, but I've noticed a lot of Glaswegian speakers uvularise vowels where they have a phonological rhotic afterwards. So if you listen to the speech of the comedian Kevin Bridges,
I always remember my first ever altercation with a friendly madman. I always remember my first ever altercation with a friendly madman.
So he uvularises vowels when there should be a rhotic after them. And that could be a holdover of the same kind of thing in that area, but possibly not, I don't know. Even things like consonant aspiration and whether a t was alveolar t or dental t are really hard to say. So modern English has a pretty consistent pattern of consonant aspiration, but that's definitely not always been the case. So there's evidence for non-standard aspiration patterns in earlier versions of English and Scots, and those are all things that are noticeable when you're speaking. I suppose the analogy would be a little bit like if a person who'd never seen a lion or a tiger before was shown a tiger skeleton and a lion skeleton. You can tell all sorts of things about the posture of the animal and the diet of the animal if you know where to look, but the features that would be most obvious if you saw the animal in real life are completely invisible to you. And likewise, I think a lot of the most distinctive features of Old English dialects, unfortunately, are probably lost to us because they don't preserve in texts. But having said that, I'm going to have a go at pronouncing the same sentence in versions of the four major dialects of the late Anglo-Saxon period, bearing in mind there would have been more regional variation than I'm going to show here. He laatst mich, to tham helvon lichon lerte. He laadest mich, to tham helvon lichon lichte. He leedst mich, to tham hierben lichon lerte. He laadst mich, to tham helvon lichon lerte.